There was the pomp and ceremony of a full state funeral, the grief of millions of common citizens. But what made this occasion unique was the list of mourners: kings, presidents, prime ministers, and dictators from virtually every country on earth. The leaders of East, West, and all points in between had gathered in tiny Yugoslavia to pay tribute to a man with the courage to stand alone.
It was an example of the fact that Tito was so much larger than life on the international scene.
Yugoslavians had lost the father of their country, the heroic figure who had ruled them for 35 years.
The reaction in Yugoslavia when Tito died, try and add the death of Churchill and the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, and put the two together and that's it. People genuinely grieved, people cried. You get taxi drivers saying, I just didn't imagine that Tito could ever die.
Even before he was gone, Yugoslavs feared for their future.
I remember listening to a group of Yugoslavs, as they then called themselves, talking in a cafe, and one of them said out loud, do you think when the old man, as they called him, when the old man dies, we'll all start killing each other again? And they all felt very silent and gloomy, because they knew this would happen.
The man who came to embody the hopes of a nation was born Josip Broz in this poor peasant's house in 1892. The seventh of 14 children, he soon learned to pull his weight, laboring to keep the family farm afloat. Only 6 of his siblings survived into adulthood, a searing lesson to the young Josip of the fragility of life.
His mother, who he admired very much, was very hard-working, the typical sort of good farmer's wife who worked very hard and looked after her children. His father was a drunkard who gambled his money away and was a bit of a useless character, really.
His father borrowed money from the banks and he failed, and so he was in debt. He used to use Tito when he was a little boy and send him round trying to beg and raise some money and trying to persuade the creditors not to sue. And I think this did have an effect on Tito. It upset him, I think.
The creditors hurled curses and insults at the young boy. Longing for a better life, from an early age he dreamed of immigrating to America. 250,000 Croats journeyed to the land of opportunity, but Josip's father could not afford the boat fare. Eager to strike out on his own, he trained as a metal worker and mechanic, and at age 18 set off for 3 years of wandering across Eastern Europe. From a distance, he saw great homes and luxurious lifestyles, feeding his hunger for the finer things in life.
Tito always loved dressing up, and he himself said early on that he wanted to be a waiter because then he could wear nice suits.
He tells a story about when he was a young man and somebody stole his suit, just bought, and another time he was sleeping in a barn and a cow sort of ate his suit. He knew that he'd been teased about his vanity and his love of clothes, and he knew this was rather ridiculous. But he also knew that it wasn't a terribly serious thing.
When World War I erupted, he was called into service by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Sent to fight on the Russian front, he showed himself a natural leader of men, becoming at age 21 the youngest sergeant major in the Austrian army. He commanded daring raids on enemy positions until he was wounded and taken prisoner in 1915. After 2 years as a Russian POW, Broz awoke to find himself surrounded by armed Bolsheviks. The Russian Revolution had begun. Although sympathetic to the workers' revolt, survival was his only goal. In 1918, he took refuge in the home of peasants with a beautiful daughter, Pelagia Belousova. A year later, he married her, escaping Russia and returning with her to Yugoslavia.
He might, I think, have settled down quite quietly to married life in Yugoslavia, but several of his children died, and he was particularly upset by the death of a little daughter of 3. And I think he wanted something to take his mind off these personal tragedies. And he then joined the Communist Party, although it was banned, and worked in the trade union movement.
He became stirred by the Marxist-Leninist vision of working-class power. Why, he wondered, should he and his fellow workers toil for Yugoslavia's hereditary monarchy? International communism was a cause worthy of his talents and his ambitions. Josip Broz had become a true believer.
He never forgot that he had received his education through the Communist Party. All he was, he would say, in terms of his education and his understanding, was due to the Communist Party.
He spent much of the 1920s secretly organizing the Yugoslav Communist Party. In 1928, he was arrested for distributing communist propaganda, a crime he proudly admitted. At his trial, he put his country on notice that the fight for its future had just begun, shouting to a packed courtroom, "Long live the Communist Party! Long live the world revolution!" His defiance cost him 5 years in jail, years that only deepened his commitment to communism. Consumed by his political crusade, he was apparently indifferent when his wife left him, taking the children and returning to Russia.
Tito is somebody who needed a woman. He always needed a woman there. But he was very quick to drop them. Whether he gets an assignment abroad, whether he's in prison, whether he has to evacuate, he drops the woman that he is with and then eventually finds another one.
Released from jail at age 41, Moscow called upon him to serve as an international communist spy. Demonstrating a flair for the dramatic, he became a master of disguise, carrying out information gathering missions across Europe. He used dozens of fake passports and delighted in assuming different identities.
He used many aliases. He traveled as a Comintern agent in France. He once joked about he knew Paris, he says, but not the same places that other tourists in Paris went to.
He moves backwards and forwards between illegal life in Yugoslavia, going abroad, Vienna, Paris, and he is very much making his mark, being tried out by the Soviet leadership and the leadership of the Communist International, a boss on probation.
His first and final alias was a common Croatian name he adopted as his own, Tito. By 1940, he rose to head of the tiny Yugoslav Communist Party. But his organization was powerless, and he was unknown outside his own country in communist circles. Just 4 years later, all the world would know his name. In early 1941, 49-year-old Josip Broz Tito headed the small and virtually powerless Yugoslav Communist Party. His dream of overthrowing the ruling monarchy seemed but a fantasy. Everything changed when the Nazi war machine struck in April 1941. The Germans bombed Belgrade into rubble, invading and occupying the capital city within a week. Partitioned into 4 provinces under foreign control, Yugoslavia had ceased to exist.
This is the chance to foment revolution now that the Yugoslav state, which he has been fighting against, has been destroyed by somebody else. This is the great chance that he's going to grab with both hands.
The Nazis used ancient religious hatreds to divide and conquer the country. They granted policing duties to the Ustasha, a fanatical sect of Croatian separatists bent on destroying the Greek Orthodox Serbs.
They said they would get rid of the Serbs, they would convert a third to a Roman Catholic Church. They would expel a third and they would kill a third. In actual fact, they did kill about a third.
Marauding bands of Ustasha committed atrocities that shocked even the Nazis, hacking whole villages to death, forcing peasants to dig their own graves, and then burying them alive.
Croat Ustashas went into the villages and they would ask the children to make the sign of the cross. And if they made it like this, left to right, which is what Roman Catholics do, they were all right. But if they made the sign of the cross that way, which is what Serbs Orthodox did, they killed them.
Tito built on his communist base to organize a group of freedom fighters, the partisans. Ustasha brutality drove Serbs en masse into the ranks of the partisans. Publicly, Tito's goal was to expel foreign invaders. Privately, he meant to liberate his country from its own monarchy.
Everybody who met him throughout his life mentions what charisma he had, what personality he had. This served him in very good stead. And when he became a leader of the partisans during the Second War, he was very clever. He didn't show himself too often to his men. He kept a certain aloofness from them, which impressed them all the more on the occasions when he did appear to them.
The partisans carried on a guerrilla war against the German army, destroying supply lines, ambushing reconnaissance teams, harassing them at every opportunity. At the cost of many lives, they succeeded well enough to draw Berlin's attention.
Hitler had issued an order that for every German soldier shot or even wounded, 100 Yugoslav civilians would be selected randomly and shot. This they proceeded to do with great vigor.
Hitler's order was designed to discourage civilians from aiding the partisans, but the Fuhrer had blundered.
The Serbs in the village, the Croats and the Slovenes essentially said, I can be shot for nothing just as easily as shot for going to the forest. It was far safer for them to go to the forest, join the partisans, take a gun and fight the Germans.
Tito inspired his men by sharing the many hardships of their long and desperate struggle. Forced to live outside in the winters, they endured the bitter cold, resulting in frostbite and even death. Seeking any relief from the elements, they searched out dank mountain caves in which to rest their weary bodies. In 1942, Hitler realized that the Allies might well try to liberate Europe through the Balkans. Yugoslavia, previously a military sideshow, was suddenly a major theater of the European war. Churchill and FDR took increased interest in its internal affairs. Hitler offered 100,000 Reichsmarks for Tito's capture or his assassination. When that failed, he ordered a series of offenses against the partisans. Tito was not above a deal with the devil. Desperately battling both Nazis and Yugoslav royalists, he secretly tried to arrange a live-and-let-live deal with the Germans. But Hitler squelched the plan, saying, "I never parley with rebels. I shoot rebels." For a year, Tito's highly mobile guerrillas avoided a direct encounter with the Nazis. By June 1943, 120,000 German and Italian troops surrounded just 20,000 partisans in the mountains above the river Drina. Tito was trapped.
Suddenly a German plane flew very low above the place where Tito and his commanders were standing and dropped some bombs. And several of Tito's commanders were killed. And Tito threw himself on the ground, and his dog threw himself over Tito. And the splinters from the bomb killed the dog and saved Tito's life. Tito was wounded by another splinter, but he would have been killed if the dog hadn't saved his life.
Through 10 days of relentless attacks, Tito's calm courage held the partisans together. Hitler furiously demanded that he be killed. The Luftwaffe zeroed in on his headquarters.
With the air thick with German bombers and the whole weight of German infantry and artillery thrown against him, he managed to cross this river and climb up the other side and then escape sort of 20, 30 miles and leaving the Germans behind absolutely exhausted.
Tito had survived and saved 2/3 of his men. The fight, which came to be known as the Battle of Sutjeska, made him an instant legend. Yugoslavs from all walks of life flocked to join the heroic partisans. Within a few short months, Tito commanded 220,000 men. His compatriots saw him as a brave warrior, not yet aware that his true calling was as a politician.
Tito would have been a good politician in America. He would have been a pretty good politician in much of Europe because he had a self-confidence that the people whose support he sought knew him and understood him, and that he knew them and understood them.
Tito never forgot his overriding goal, to end the war with him atop a communist government. Needing to win the hearts and minds of the Yugoslav people, he kept up a steady drumbeat of propaganda. Every partisan division carried typewriters and mimeograph machines ready to produce one-sheets glorifying Marshal Tito and his Liberation Front.
I remember one attack, one of their real prizes was liberating a small printing press. They then asked me if I could arrange for another printing press to be parachuted to them. They regarded this as just as important, or maybe more important, than getting guns and explosives.
Now a certified war hero, Tito branded Yugoslav royalists as German collaborators.
The propaganda machine is also very good at hiding things. While the propaganda machine is blowing out to everybody who wants to know, and even to those who don't want to know, the way in which his rivals have had contacts with Germans, Italians, and various collaborationist administrations, he's very good at hiding that he has had any contacts with the Germans at all.
In August 1944, he achieved his greatest propaganda feat to date, meeting as equals with Winston Churchill. It was an odd pairing. The old imperialist ready to join hands with any foe of Hitler, and the crafty communist war hero.
I wish to assure from this place the people and leading men of Great Britain that they should consider the people of my country as their truest allies, because the people of New Yugoslavia are tending towards the same aim as the people of Great Britain.
He met with Churchill, gave Churchill commitments about the post-war world, democracy, freedom of the press, freedom of personal movement, which didn't materialize at all.
Having publicly embraced the West, Tito secretly raced to keep them from claiming the Balkans. Worried that they would prevent him from establishing a communist government, he turned to his old sponsors in the Kremlin.
So suddenly, without telling Churchill, he flew off to Moscow and persuaded Stalin to hurry up and occupy Belgrade and Yugoslavia before the British could.
Tito had played both sides to perfection, taking his allies where and when he could find them. He had thrust himself to the pinnacle of power.
I remember the victory party at the end of the war, a huge reception, British, American, Russian officers, as well as partisan officers. He presided over this with a grace and dignity that was absolutely amazing for a man who had come out of the forest, been a communist underground worker all his life. One almost had the impression that he had been born to it as a Habsburg prince.
The poor Croat peasant had risen to reign over a united Yugoslavia. He was ready to play a pivotal role on the world stage. Emerging from obscurity into the global spotlight, in 1945, the victorious Tito was a mysterious figure. Rumors abounded that Tito stood for Third International Terrorist Organization, or that the Yugoslav leader was, in fact, a woman. While foreigners struggled to divine the man and his intentions, he was busy consolidating his power.
I said, I hoped that he would allow, in addition to the communist parties, other independent political parties to be reestablished. He thought for a moment, looked at me, and I thought I detected a little bit of a smile on his face. He said, well, of course, that would be possible. We could allow other political parties to be organized, but what would they do? Who would they represent? The Communist Party represents the people.
Tito did not kill for revenge or pleasure. But when his power or that of the Communist Party was threatened, he was more than willing to take extreme measures.
A number of the potential dissidents, a number of those who were still attached to the monarchy, a number of those who were excessively nationalist from Tito's point of view were executed or imprisoned. In the early years after the war, it was a fairly brutal regime.
In the West, Tito was considered an ogre, second only to Stalin. Yugoslavia was popularly referred to as Soviet Satellite Number 1. Then, in 1946, the Cold War threatened to grow hot.
The Yugoslavs suddenly shot down 2 American aircraft, which they claimed had violated Yugoslav airspace. And this caused an enormous amount of controversy in the United States, with newspaper editorials demanding that we take action. There was even some talk of war. But that simply contributed to the American view of Tito as another ruthless communist dictator.
Blinded by anti-communist fervor, the West failed to recognize the tensions between Belgrade and Moscow. From the first, Tito and Stalin had forged an uneasy alliance.
When he first went to see Stalin, he already then wore a marshal's uniform, and Stalin at that time was also marshal. And Stalin sort of looked at this imposter. He immediately took a disliking to this man, obviously feeling that this man is not going to be obedient like everyone else, which he wasn't.
In the immediate post-war years, Tito embarked on an ambitious plan for economic self-sufficiency. Stalin insisted that all of Eastern Europe contribute to Soviet reconstruction and Soviet welfare. To make matters worse, in 1946, the Russians sent a film crew to Yugoslavia to shoot a propaganda film about Yugoslav resistance during the war. Tito was annoyed to learn that the script portrayed him as playing a minor role. He was infuriated to discover that the crew members were actually Russian spies.
They were holding terrific parties for the Yugoslav communists, and lots of drink, lots of girls and things, and then afterwards trying to blackmail them and get them to work for the Russian Secret Service.
Such provocations only made Tito assert greater independence, something Stalin could not abide. In 1948, he ordered Tito to immediately form a federation with Russian-controlled Bulgaria, an obvious ploy to add Yugoslavia to Stalin's empire.
Stalin expects Tito to simply submit. Stalin felt that his power was overwhelming. He supposedly told a visitor that he would wave his little finger and Tito would fall.
For the 56-year-old Tito, breaking with Stalin was fraught with loss and danger. Russia was the birthplace of the International Communist Revolution, the crusade to which he had devoted the last 25 years. And he knew that anyone who defied Stalin faced a very short life expectancy. No matter the risk, Tito decided he could not relinquish his country's independence. When he refused to submit, Stalin cast him out of the Comintern, the alliance of international communism. Under enormous strain, Tito's health began to fail. Locked in desperate battle, he turned to his fellow Yugoslavians, asking for their faith and support in his time of peril.
It took a great deal of courage on behalf of the Yugoslavs, but I think that Stalin was also allowing his megalomania to get the better of him in his belief that he could conquer this person. Tito, after all, had fought very hard for the liberation of Yugoslavia during the war, and he was no more willing to submit to Stalin's demands than he had been to submit to the German occupation.
The Kremlin unleashed its massive propaganda machine on Tito, labeling him everything from a fascist to a murderer. His communist neighbors, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, suspended trade.
Tito and Yugoslavia are very much left out in the cold. The economy absolutely collapses. Tito and the communist leadership can whistle in the dark to give themselves courage, and they are very, very brave, but they are totally isolated.
Tito and his country were demons in the West, outcasts in the East. Stalin ordered the Hungarian army to train for an invasion of Yugoslavia. They massed on the border, preparing for a lightning strike on Belgrade. As 1948 came to a close, Tito's Yugoslavia teetered on the edge of destruction. The 1948 break between Tito and Stalin shocked the West. Certain that Tito was completely loyal to Moscow, many Americans treated the split as an elaborate deception. Fearful Yugoslavs knew better. They saw enemy troops mustering near their borders, and they dreaded Stalin as a ruthless monster, a man who had coldly murdered millions of his own countrymen. The Soviet leader hesitated, apparently convinced that Tito would relent under the enormous pressure.
We know now that the Czech communists went to stay with Stalin on his holiday retreat on the Black Sea and said, "Why don't you send in the army to crush Tito?" And Stalin said, "I don't want to crush Tito. Tito's basically a good man. I want Tito to recant. I want Tito at my feet, begging for forgiveness, and I will forgive him."
Stalin grossly underestimated his opponent. Tito had bargained with Hitler. He would not hesitate to negotiate with Harry Truman.
We can fulfill our obligation of service in the cause of peace only by maintaining our strength.
In early 1949, the United States and Yugoslavia reached a secret agreement. In return for American economic assistance, Tito would maintain his independence from the Soviet bloc.
An inside look at Yugoslavia, newest target of the wrath of Moscow. The eyes of the world are focused on Belgrade, its capital on the river Danube, whence Yugoslavia's Marshal Tito is now directing his own Cold War against the common form.
In 1950, Stalin turned his sights on Korea, sponsoring an invasion of the South by communist North Korea. American analysts thought that Korea might be a diversion, a test of Western will. If the West failed to respond, the thinking went, Stalin would attack his primary target, Yugoslavia.
We sent the secret military assistance to Tito in 1950 and 51 to encourage him in the belief that if the Soviets did attack, that we would come to his assistance. The aid itself is not very substantial. One American official described it as a freighter full of some old guns. But it was psychological. It was meant to tell Tito that the West valued his survival and that the West would act if necessary.
The arms shipment sent an unmistakable message to Stalin. No longer could he invade Yugoslavia with impunity. By waiting for Tito to crumble, he had lost his chance to snatch the country. Tito had won. The alliance with the United States profoundly changed the face of Yugoslavia. By the mid-1950s, Tito was opening his closed society to Western journalists.
He was very good at cultivating the Western press. We even had sort of very informal dinners with him on his island, for example. We could just get in and wait for him in his residence, you know, sit down at his piano and play music. He would come, and he was quite a charming host.
Westerners were surprised to find a communist leader who openly enjoyed life. Whether hunting, fishing, or riding horses, his vigorous style was reminiscent of Teddy Roosevelt, and his effect on women was unmistakable. In 1951, he married his fourth and final wife, Jovanka, a faithful comrade from the partisan days.
A great many women in Yugoslavia were very upset when he actually got married to Jovanka, and there's tremendous jealousy, especially in the Communist Party. All the wives of the communist officials were terribly jealous.
Confident in his authority, Tito began to liberalize Yugoslavia, ending terror as a means of political repression.
Tito is quoted as saying, "Enough of the killing. We've done enough of that. We must stop it." And you began to see in Yugoslavia, say 5 to 10 years after the war was over, a different kind of approach.
The new path led to a brand of socialism known as Titoism. While the state maintained ownership of major industries, local workers were encouraged to manage their own fields or factories, and even allowed to own some private property. Trade with the West brought even greater prosperity. And as a key crossroads in the Cold War, Yugoslavia was showered with foreign aid. Once Stalin died in 1953, everyone wanted Tito's friendship.
In 1956, Khrushchev came to Belgrade to ask Tito's forgiveness. Stalin had been dead for 3 years and was now considered a despot, even in the Soviet camp. For Marshal Tito, a lifelong communist and fierce nationalist, it was a moment of supreme vindication. He remained the undisputed leader of his country and gained the distinction of having altered the history of world communism.
By maintaining close, but not too close relations with East and West, he received the benefits of an ally with no strings attached.
Tito was a superb manipulator. He was able to balance the two most powerful countries in the world. His own country is really relatively small and insignificant, but because of the Cold War, it assumed a great deal of importance, and Tito was very, very skilled at keeping both the Soviets and the Americans at arm's length.
For the rest of his life, Tito would play both sides against the other, commanding the attention and respect of the world's two great superpowers. But not even he could conquer the growing divisions within his own country. In 1960, Tito turned 68 years old and increasingly took on the role of elder statesman. With his position at home secure, he began organizing independent nations from around the globe.
Once Yugoslavia is on its own, Tito wants to use Yugoslavia as a platform for him to play a world role. He hasn't been able to do it in the communist world, so he's going to do it in the so-called Third World.
In 1961, Marshal Tito invites 25 heads of state to Belgrade for a summit conference of non-aligned nations. The meeting is significant because a neutralist Third World is established and takes its place beside the free and communist worlds.
At home and abroad, Tito won over people by sharing their concerns. His past as a poor farmer's son and common laborer kept him attuned to the working man. He was wealthy and powerful, but his unabashed delight in luxury only deepened his connection with Yugoslav peasants. If they were rich, they would have enjoyed life in the same ways he did.
He liked to wear nice clothing. He came from peasant stock. They didn't have nice clothing, and when he could afford it, many people who come from poor families like to dress up, and he liked to do that too. Tito enjoyed putting on black tie and being at a party along with any other swells who wore black tie. Why not? That's the way the diplomatic corps did it. He didn't mind doing that.
Even his reputation as a ladies' man endeared him to his countrymen.
I remember being in Belgrade, and I was in a cinema, and the newsreel came on, and Tito was shown surrounded by very beautiful Turkish women, and looking at them with some animation and excitement. Everyone in the audience was shouting out and whistling, and they were shouting things like, "Give her one for me, old man," you know, and things like that. Slightly obscene, but very friendly. And I thought, well, this is very curious. You wouldn't hear this shouted out about most dictators in a cinema, you know. But they identified with Tito.
Such was his reputation for virility that even as an old man in his 80s, rumors abounded of his affairs. For his wife Jovanka, it was too much to take.
She was madly jealous and thought he was having affairs with all these other women. And she really got on his nerves, and it began to affect his health. And on one occasion he got so exasperated he bashed his stick on the ground and broke it. Then his advisor said, "Look here, you must separate."
Tito's personal authority kept his country unified. He recognized always that religious divisions lay just below the surface and acted swiftly to crush any separatist uprising.
We would see the beginnings of some nationalist expression in Croatia, for example, where some of the Croat leaders would begin to talk in much more nationalistic terms about Croatia. And when that happened, Tito stepped in very fast, and people lost their jobs. 20 years earlier, they probably would have lost their heads.
Tito dreaded the prospect of a divided Yugoslavia, but had no secret formula for the future. When he died in 1980, at age 88, Yugoslavs were devastated.
Tito's posthumous life goes on for about 10 years. The collective leadership almost pretends that Tito is still there. The slogan is, after Tito, ? Tito. After Tito, Tito. Tito lives on after he is physically dead, as if, he was still inspiring them from the other world.
Suddenly, the cult of Tito was no longer enough to sustain the country. With the end of the Cold War, foreign aid plummeted. The economy collapsed. Religious fanaticism exploded. Yugoslavia was torn apart by civil war.
Tito was right, that the one thing you had to try to prevent was the rise of this nationalism, and because once it started, it was likely to lead to the slaughter and genocide, if you will, that we've seen since. It's a tragedy, but it's one the Yugoslav peoples have done to themselves.
In his birthplace in Kumrovec, there was a visitor's book. And when I went there the last time in September 1993, the day before, there'd been an entry by somebody, a Muslim from Bihać. When you were alive, I walked on 2 legs. Now I walk on 1. Come back, Tito, and end this war.
Today, Tito is all but ignored in Yugoslavia. His name like a distant echo from another century. Ironically, the man who cared so deeply for his homeland is best remembered by foreigners.
I have to put Tito in the group of world leaders that we all are familiar with, whether it's de Gaulle, Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin. He was in that group. He affected events. He built Yugoslavia. He became a world figure, and he must rank with those world leaders.
Tito's break with Stalin was the first crack in the monolith of international communism. Many consider it the initial step in the long process that culminated with communism in ruins and the collapse of the Soviet Union. By winning independence for his own land, he had triggered the slow death of his most cherished ideal.
He was the first man who really stood up to the Russian attempts to dominate Europe after the Second World War. And he really broke the whole idea of international communism. He started off as a communist himself. He was the destroyer of communism.
The unified Yugoslavia Tito dreamed of obviously hasn't come to pass. It's been 2 years since the war in Bosnia ended, but the peace process remains slow and fragile. Tensions are still high as Serbian, Croatian, and Muslim leaders resist pushing peace accords along. The violence has stopped, but clearly the situation is far from resolved. President Clinton recently acknowledged that U.S. forces will remain there indefinitely. It is another lesson in how hard old hatreds die. For such a relatively small region, the Balkans have played a central role in this century's history. World War I began on Serbian soil, and now the century is coming to a close on the heels of the Bosnian War, the bloodiest one Europe has seen since World War II. For Biography International, I'm Peter Graves. Thank you for watching.